The most important consideration is the Christian faith true? Not is it helpful or does it give me nice feelings, but is it true as an account of reality into which science fits?
So I find this very distressing that the sciences here are being forced into some kind of mould. You have to say there is no God if you're a real scientist. I want to say very firmly that is not the case.
It's not a conflict between science and religion, it's a conflict between two worldviews.
Many times in this debate, it's assumed that if you are of some sort of religious belief, that you're biased.
That's right.
And that those who have no religious belief
are not biased.
That they're not biased.
But that's false. That's again the assumption that the atheistic position is default. But all of us are biased.
And there appears to me to be a simple pattern that is being reproduced from the atom all the way to superclusters of galaxies, and to me that cannot be an accident by science's own laws.
Yeah, I would agree with that profoundly. The law you're referring to is the second law of thermodynamics, which in popular language means even your Cadillac's going to rust.
I think many Christians, when they feel under threat, circle the wagons. They retreat from the world. What we need is Christians who have the confidence to go into the world.
One evening at dinner, I got talking to a Nobel Prize winner, and he said, "Do you want to make a career in science?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "Well, give up these notions of God because they'll cripple you intellectually and hold you back." And I sensed that pressure, everybody in the room agreeing with him. But I quietly said to him, "Sir, tell me, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've got?"
Are science and Christianity at war? Has science exposed Christian belief as nothing more than myth and superstition? Has God been forever banished from public life as yet another discredited deity? God is dead, or so some in the scientific community would have us believe, and it seems that many Christians, for all practical purposes, have conceded the point. Fearing science and thinking that their faith cannot withstand the harsh light of scrutiny, they have privatized faith, and in so doing have assigned to it a place of irrelevance. But not all are ready to surrender the field. They maintain that the Christian faith has more than spiritual and moral power. It has, they say, an intellectual power that is neither at war nor inconsistent with authentic scientific inquiry. I am Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, a Christian think tank dedicated to addressing those issues where Christianity and culture intersect. The science-religion debate is unquestionably one of those dangerous intersections. That there is a war of sorts, there can be no doubt. But is it a war between science and Christianity, or has science become a weapon in a larger cultural battle? We will address these issues, traveling to Oxford University and back to talk with some of the best minds of science and theology, Dr. John Lennox and Professor Alister McGrath. By the end of our journey, we will see that this is not purely an academic issue, but one having consequences at every level of society. We hope that you will leave encouraged, informed, and with a confidence that Christ's Lordship extends beyond the private life to every inch of the human experience. The growing tension between some in the scientific and religious communities is obvious even to the casual observer. Science, it seems, rolls back the frontiers of faith with each new discovery. So much so, it is mockingly asserted that God can only be found these days in the gaps that science has not yet closed. Meanwhile, a new gap has developed between these two disciplines, these magisteria. Some think efforts to bridge this gap are misguided because, they say, science is based on evidence, while faith flourishes only where there is a lack of evidence. And that's part of the problem. The way the discussion is often framed is science versus faith. We may reasonably translate that as fact versus fiction or the rational versus the irrational. In accepting this model, Christians have enabled their detractors to cast belief in God in the same light as belief in Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot or Richard Dawkins's much-loved flying spaghetti monster. If Christians accept the notion that their faith is in no way relevant to academic endeavors, what other spheres of life will follow? The arts? Politics? Education? It is easy to see how such a view can have far-reaching and, in the long run, catastrophic consequences. Are science and Christian belief incompatible with one another?
Not at all. In fact, I think they complement one another. Indeed, I'd go even further and say that Christian belief was essentially the cradle out of which science, certainly in the 16th and 17th century, sprang. The phenomenon of the meteoric rise of science at that time has been analysed by many philosophers of science, and there's a thesis which is commonly known as Whitehead's thesis, after Alfred North Whitehead. And it's this, in the words of C.S. Lewis, I think, who formulated it the best way, that men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, it was the cradle of the Christian worldview that gave science the possibility of birth. So it would be rather curious now to think that science and Christian belief were incompatible.
But there is this view in the post-Enlightenment world, anyway, that science and religion operate in different spheres, or as Stephen Jay Gould has put it, that they're non-overlapping magisteria, noma, that science functions over here and religion over here, and the two shall never meet. What response do you have for that?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of sense in that, in the sense that if you think about it, take the Bible, for instance. It's clearly not a scientific textbook. We don't teach algebra from it, and we don't teach atomic physics from it. It's clearly handling different kinds of questions. And the usual way of explaining this is to say that science tends to deal with the how questions, whereas religion in general, the Bible in particular, deals with the why questions. And I think it's important to set that up first, but it needs to be more nuanced than that.
Professor McGrath goes further.
What Stephen Jay Gould was saying is we can construct little boxes. Here is religion, here is science. Science does its business over here, religion does its business over there, and there the twain shall meet, so they can just get on with it and not interfere with each other. Now, of course, there's a very obvious question: who decides what goes in each box? But I don't accept this. I think it's a very, very simplistic and very, very inadequate model.
And indeed, when you read the small print, it looks rather curious, because when you ask Gould, as I understand him, having read his book, what science deals with reality, and religion deals with everything else, the fairy tales and Father Christmas. Now, it seems to me that's completely false.
At the University of Oxford, we sat down with two men who are uniquely qualified to weigh in on the subject. Alister McGrath, Professor of Historical Theology at Harris Manchester College, and Dr. John Lennox, Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green College. In addition to his work as a theologian, Professor McGrath is a molecular biophysicist and has written numerous books on the science-religion debate. Dr. Lennox has also been very active in this arena, speaking to a sold-out crowd at the McWane Science Center in Birmingham, Alabama, and at a symposium on the subject at Samford University. He also visited with us at Fixed Point Foundation's Latimer House.
Perhaps an illustration will help here on that difference between the spheres, the magisteria as he calls them. If you take, for example, a cake, here's Aunt Matilda, and she's baked a beautiful cake, and we assemble Nobel Prize winners in front of her to analyse the cake. They'll do it scientifically, they'll tell us about its chemical elements, and the physicists will reduce it to elementary particles, and we'll have a wonderful description of it. But if we then ask the scientists, why did she make the cake? The physicist won't be able to say, nor will the chemist. In fact, no scientist will be able to answer the question why she made it, None of us will unless she reveals it to us. Now, where I think Stephen Jay Gould comes unstuck, and it's not only a person like myself who's a convinced Christian that disagrees with this, is that there clearly is no way you can separate the things completely. Certainly not if you're going to say science deals with reality and religion deals with everything else, because that's simply absurd. I would rather speak in terms of partially overlapping magisteria.
I prefer the approach we find in the writings of Francis Collins, who is director of the Human Genome Project. And what Collins is saying is, look, faith illuminates science. It can't be detached from it. It gives you a way of looking at science that makes it more intelligible, that gives you added motivation for studying it. And it seems to me really that scientists ought to be able to bring their faith to the study of their science and expect it to be enriched and illuminated by doing so.
I'm passionate about science, as you know, but it's right to recognise their limits. For instance, what can science really say in terms of analysing the kind of beauty we see here? Or a poem. Can science tell us whether a poem's a good poem or a bad poem? Of course it can. And at the level of morality, science can tell us that if you put strychnine into your grandmother's tea, it'll kill her. But I don't think it can tell us whether it's right or wrong to do so to get your hands on her property. And I think this view of scientism that tells us that science is the only way to truth is flawed. Bertrand Russell once said, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. But that statement itself is not a statement of science, so we cannot know it. And I think, although I admire Russell for his great logical mind, his logic let him down there. I think it's a much more happy view to think in terms of what Sir Peter Medawar said, who won the Nobel Prize and whose name is on buildings here in Oxford. And he said the easy way to see that science has limits is that it cannot answer the questions of a child. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the purpose of life? Those are the questions where we have to look beyond science, and it's no disrespect to science to say that it can't answer every question.
There's been efforts to establish a morality apart from God. In your view, how successful have these efforts been?
Not very successful, but I think that's actually a very deep and important question, because the traditional source of morality is, of course, God. And if you remove God from the equation, you don't have a lot of option for other sources of morality, in the sense that it's either going to be nature, raw nature, and the processes of nature, or society, or a combination of both. And it seems to me that the buffer that you run into, or the major difficulty you run into, was pointed out by the Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, when he said that it is impossible to go from an is to an ought. In other words, the difficulty is, how could mindless, amoral processes ever impose a sense of duty, of oughtness upon us? Dostoevsky, the Russian author, made the very provocative statement in The Brothers Karamazov, Если Бога нет, то и всё позволено. If God does not exist, then everything is permissible. And I think he hits the essence of this. In other words, if you've no transcendent dimension, you're going to always have difficulty in creating a real ought from an is. And I think part of the confusion that we see in the realms of bioethics, jurisprudence, and business ethics arises from the fact that people are finding it almost impossible to find a moral base without God. So people do not like to ask the question, who said so?
Popular syndicated radio talk show hosts William Bussey and Rick Burgess interview Dr. Lennox.
I love that Dr. John Lennox, in the world he runs in, he doesn't even know who Bill Maher is, which I love. It's just what we talked about. He looks at a guy who was interviewing him and he says, shouldn't we all just be good just because it's good to be good people? Okay, Mr. Maher, what do you mean by good?
Exactly. I think that's
where does good come from?
Yes, exactly.
What do you mean by that?
Many of these people criticize Christianity and say it's harmful and all this kind of thing. And I want to ask your question. I think that's more than common sense. That's profound, philosophical, that question. It's saying, where do you get your concept of good from? People have got rid of God, and now they're floundering about, and you see it in the law, you see it in business, you see it in bioethics. What base can we have for ethics? And it's got so politically correct that you don't ask the question, what's your authority? You know the schoolboy question. I mean, we've all heard it. Who said so?
Right.
But, I mean, that's the question we need to ask. What is the authority behind ethics? And if there's no God, what are the possibilities? Raw nature, or nature and society, or a mixture of both? It's no wonder we're floundering.
You've spoken of partially overlapping magisteria. Give me an example of that.
Well, I think the first obvious example is the origin of the universe. The scientific account is start with a hot big bang about 15 billion years ago or so. And the biblical account is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Scripture claims that there exists a God who's ultimately responsible for it, and says there is a beginning. Now, here's where you have very much an overlap, because the notion that there was a beginning to the universe is a relatively late comer in terms of science, because Aristotle's idea of an eternal universe dominated thinking in the Middle Ages and so on for a very long time. And it was first in the 1960s when, for example, Arno Penzias discovered the evidence for the microwave background that science began, and in some quarters very reluctantly, to talk in terms of a beginning, whereas Scripture has been stating it for centuries. So there's something very hard, a hard fact, so to speak, that you can approach from both sides. And it seems to me this is one of the good examples of convergence between biblical teaching and science itself.
This idea of non-overlapping magisteria seems to be the prevailing assumption both inside the academy and outside of it. Why is this so?
I think that's very hard to say. It's being hotly debated at the moment. But it's a very convenient way of looking at it. There seems to me to be a real clash. The real clash is at the level of worldviews. It's materialistic atheism versus Christian theism, if you like. That's the way it appears to me. And, of course, saying that there are non-overlapping magisteria is very convenient because it silences the people who come from the biblical point of view. They can't, by definition, say anything about science. It lets the scientists carry on and occupy much more of the cultural space, if you like, and it perhaps unconsciously, certainly many people are unaware of it, it relegates religion very much more to the private sphere and brings it down to almost nothing. It's fairy stories and Father Christmas.
Well, and that's my next question for you. How much of it do you think is fueled by a desire of those people of faith to simply avoid the tough questions and go underground with their belief?
Well, that's the tragedy, and I don't exactly understand it. It seems to me to arise from a total misunderstanding of what faith is. I wouldn't think the Christian faith worth even thinking about if it wasn't substantiated by evidence, and if it couldn't take its stand in the public marketplace of ideas as a defensible world view. But there is a danger, I see, and one can understand it with people who don't know much science. The cultural authority of science is so powerful that they don't have the answers, and so they rush into a kind of ghetto mentality and pull down the hatches and circle the wagons and hope that at least within their own little community they can retain some semblance of belief. But that's no good. You know, these are very big ideas. They're mutually exclusive. We need to discuss them in public. So I am very much for the public discussion. I don't believe faith is for a private area.
So you would say that one's faith and one's public life, that they're partially overlapping magisteria?
Oh, I would think they should totally overlap, in fact. You see, what we're really talking about, Larry, as I see it, is truth. The thing that figures with me, the bottom line, the most important consideration is the Christian faith true? Not is it helpful or does it give me nice feelings, but is it true as an account of reality into which science fits? That is the key question for me. And you can't keep that hidden in a box.
Dr. Lennox at the McWane Science Center.
When I came to Cambridge, I discovered it's not only the questions you ask, but it's the questions you are asked that can be formative in shaping the compass bearing of your life. And in my first week as a mathematics student, someone said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're Irish, aren't you?" They all believe in God over there and they fight about it. And that was a fascinating intellectual challenge. After all, he could have been right. Was it just Irish genetics or heredity? Or was this belief in God true? So I was faced with a dilemma that many people face, particularly in the contemporary world. Do I simply privatize my faith and let it be something that I believe in quiet and keep to the public facts of science, but never discuss in public my faith in God? And some people feel that's the way to solve the problem. Science and the public facts, faith privatized, never the two will meet. I was not happy with that view, and I was delighted when eventually I came to study quantum physics that my teacher, Sir John Polkinghorne, held exactly the same view. Why? Because he was interested in finding the truth about reality.
Certainly, there are differences between science and religion, but they are both concerned to ask what is the best way of making sense of things, and that seems to me to be an important common ground.
In 1916, psychologist James Luba polled 1,000 scientists about their religious convictions. The study found that 40% believed in God. Luba concluded that with the advance of education, there would be a corresponding decline in religious belief among scientists. To test this hypothesis, researchers conducted a similar study in 1997, and to the astonishment of many, found the results unchanged. Here, Professor McGrath and Dr. Lennox help us to understand that there is more to the science-religion debate than meets the eye.
The conflict is not actually between science and religion at all. That is to be seen on the elementary observation that there are leading scientists up to Nobel Prize-winning level who are atheists. And there are leading scientists up to Nobel Prize-winning level who are believers in God. That simple fact is enough to show me that it must be a much more nuanced thing, a much more sophisticated thing. It cannot be that science and religion are at war with each other in essence. I'd like to submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is in a way simple. It's not a conflict between science and religion, it's a conflict between two worldviews. One worldview that says the universe is self-explanatory, bottom-up, in terms of matter and energy. And the other worldview that says the universe is not self-explanatory. There is a creator and a sustainer. Those worldviews have been around for centuries. And therefore we can ask what I think is the real question. The real question is, with which of those two worldviews does science sit most comfortably?
So you would say that science and Christianity, or religion more generally speaking, are not at war with one another?
They are not at war with each other, though many would want there to be a phony war in which they are made to seem as if they are in opposition. And certainly again, if we mention Richard Dawkins as an obvious example, he will argue that these two are locked in mortal combat and only one can emerge victorious, and it must be science. But I think a more considered account of this would say that there are certainly points of tension, but that the overall thrust of each actually is remarkably symbiotic and sympathetic. And therefore this is potentially a very significant dialogue that needs to go ahead without this presupposition that they are in permanent conflict.
If science and religion are not at war, or more specifically, if science and Christianity are not at war, then what is all the fuss?
I think we must back up a bit, because somebody listening to our conversation is going to say, now, just a minute, there is a conflict between science and religion. I mean, Galileo. Just look at the way the church treated Galileo. And they may even want to refer to the Huxley-Wilberforce debate in Oxford.
1925, the Scopes monkey trials.
That kind of thing. But you see, if you analyse, the Galileo thing is very important historically, because if you analyse it, you find it is not actually an example of a war between science and religion. Galileo believed the Bible, but he started, and he believed it at the end. The problem there was that the Roman Catholic Church, in common with everybody else at the time, except Galileo and a few others, had accepted Aristotelianism, that said there was the earth in the centre that didn't move. And this was an example.
Ironically, pagan, pre-Christian thought.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Christians, the professing Christians, had bought into it, and they happened to be wrong. They'd hitched their wagon to the wrong star. The irony of it was that there was Galileo, a believer in Scripture, advancing new ideas that were far more compatible than anything that had been advanced before. And what hindered it was a professing Christian church that was allied to a philosophy that was pre-scientific. You see, that's a very big lesson, incidentally, historically, of the danger of hitching your wagon too closely to a science that's constantly changing.
Let me give you another one that some might point to, Copernicus.
Right.
He floats his theory that that we do not live in a geocentric universe, but a heliocentric universe. And he, too, received similar treatment. And many argued on the basis of Scripture that Copernicus was wrong. The sun rises and the sun sets.
Yes, that's exactly right. But you see, we don't even think about that today. That's the interesting thing. If we'd been having this discussion, a few centuries ago, we probably, both of us, would have been arguing on the basis that the Earth's at the centre of the universe and everything else rotates around, and everybody would have thought that's marvellous. But we've moved beyond that, because we can see that the description, the sun rises, the sun sets, is what we phenomenologically observe. That's what it looks like. I've known even physicists say that, that the sun rises. But we could put it in much more sophisticated language. The fact that the Bible talks about it phenomenologically in that way is not evidence in any direction in the sense of what the actual situation is. That is what it looks like. See, the mistake that was being made was that geometry is important. That is, that it was important physically to have a fixed Earth in the geometrical centre of the universe. But now we realise that it's not geometry or geographical or stellar position that's important. The fact that human beings are made in the image of God and this is their home and God has made this their home has nothing to do with geometry. We can see that now, but it's a warning to future generations that they need to be careful, that their interpretations too are not hitched perhaps to the wrong star. Science in the 1960s came rather reluctantly, actually, to the view that there was a beginning. And some scientists in this country, for example, Sir John Maddox, who was the editor of Nature at the time, I remember it very well, saying, we can't go down the road of believing that there was a beginning to the universe because it'll add too much leverage to people who believe in creation. So there was a contemporary scientific advance being resisted because it seemed to be supporting something that the Bible had been saying for centuries, which is a rather curious irony, actually. If you read Scripture, you see it asserts there is a beginning. If that were taken seriously, scientists might have looked at it a bit earlier. And the fact that we discover evidence for it in terms of the microwave background, the expansion of the universe, the receding galaxies, and all this kind of thing, acts as a confirmation of Scripture. So it doesn't act as a proof, though.
So the opposite is also true. Just as science can assist us in our interpretation and understanding of Scripture, Scripture, if I hear you correctly, can also assist us in our understanding of science.
Yes, But there I want to bore into that by observing that we're dealing with two different sets of questions, although they overlap somewhere in the middle. You see, science has its limits.
Many times in this debate, it's assumed that that if you are of some sort of religious belief, that you're biased.
That's right.
And that those who have no religious belief
are not biased.
That they're not biased.
But that's false. That's again the assumption that the atheistic position is default. But all of us are biased.
In some way or another.
Yes, of course we are. And the important thing to do is to recognize our biases. The atheist is biased by an a priori belief, as is the Christian. I freely admit to you, I am biased. But I want to take account of that bias. Can I justify the bias? That is the question.
And are you willing to submit it to scrutiny?
Exactly, exactly. And the new atheists, interestingly enough, if you look at Sam Harris's recent book, Letter to Christian Nation, they want to, and Dan Dennett even more particularly, in his book on religion as a natural phenomenon, they want to submit religion to scientific analysis. But they unconsciously leave out the fact that if they wanted to be even-handed, they'd have to subject their atheism to the same analysis. But they don't offer that because they believe that atheism is the default position. They do not see it as a belief system, which it is. We have rather pleasant dinners at my college at Cambridge, and once I was sitting beside a man and he asked me what I did. I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, we're in for a boring evening then. Well, I said, I try to make up for it, for being interested in the big questions of life, and the philosophy of science and religion, as to whether there's a God or not. Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought then. He said, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, and we've nothing to talk about. And he grew quite angry. He said, I wish I wasn't sitting beside you. Which is not always the best start of an evening, ladies and gentlemen. But I did what I usually do when I'm in a panic. I smiled. And I said, you know, I'm fascinated by reductionism. He said, are you really? I said, absolutely. What kind of reductionist are you? I know at least 3 kinds. Well, he said, I'm an ontological reductionist. I said, are you? Well, I said, we're going to have a great time. I said, you believe that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry? He said, absolutely. So I said, well, now, I said, I'm only an innocent pure mathematician, but I said, have a look at the menu on the table. Roast chicken, he said, it should be okay. I said, I don't mean that. Now, everything reduced to physics and chemistry? He said, yes. So I said, have a look at these letters, R-O-A-S-T. I said, please explain to me the semiotics of the letters in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was dead silence. Explain to me how these letters carry meaning at the higher level in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was silence. And his wife said, get out of that if you can. Which wasn't very kind of her, but he didn't try.
Science has shown us the solar system. Science has shown us our galaxy. And now with the Hubble Space Telescope, we see clusters of galaxies, and we see light years into the past and out into space. And there appears to me to be a simple pattern that is being reproduced from the atom all the way to superclusters of galaxies. And to me, that cannot be an accident by science's own laws.
Yeah, I would agree with that profoundly. The law you're referring to is the second law of thermodynamics, which in popular language means even your Cadillac's going to rust. That's the basic idea. But I think you hit on a very important thing when you say, how can what we see have organized itself? There's a lot of talk about self-organization these days, but that needs to be probed very carefully, because the materialistic worldview, if there is no God and the universe is a closed system of cause and effect, necessitates that everything can be explained simply in terms of physics and chemistry bottom up. But if I take a page of paper like this and I look at the writing on it, as a Nobel Prize winner, Roger Sperry, once said, the meaning of the message is not going to be found in the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. You need an author, you need an intelligence to explain that level. And one of the questions that people sometimes bypass is, the laws are there, but where did they come from?
That the question of origins matters is evidenced by just how hotly the issue is contested. In America, one need look no further than two famous cases which highlight the debate: the trial of John Scopes for teaching evolution in a public school, and the recent case in Dover, Pennsylvania that saw intelligent design banned from public schools. The Bible, from the opening verse, is no less emphatic on the point. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. With that statement, a line was drawn in the sand. Here we discuss Genesis, evolution, and the cultural power associated with the creation story.
Let's shift gears just a moment here and let's talk about the theory of evolution. The word evolution is highly nuanced. Now, help us unpack it just a bit and explain to us its various meanings and applications.
Well, the word evolution means several different things, as you suggest. It first means change. For example, we could talk about the evolution of the coastline or the evolution of the motor car. Now, thinking of just those two kinds of change, you can see they're very different. The first kind of evolution, that of the coastline, occurs through natural processes, wind, rain, erosion, and so on. Whereas the second kind of evolution, that of the motor car, takes place under an input of highly intelligent engineering processes. Then, when it comes to the topic of biology, it's common to split into at least three different aspects of the use of the word. First of all, there is the kind of variation that Darwin so brilliantly observed in the lengths of finch beaks and the Galapagos Islands and that kind of thing, which we often call microevolution, small variations on a theme, so to speak. Non-controversial because we can observe it. Then there is macroevolution, which is large-scale evolution, the major transitions, new organs, new body plans, that kind of thing. That, of course, is much more controversial. Many people believe that it is to be explained by microevolutionary processes, but I would have some doubts in that direction. It seems reasonable, at least, to separate those two kinds of things. And then the third one is what is frequently called molecular evolution, that is the origin of life. Although the word evolution there can be very misleading. Theodosius Dobzhansky, who in many ways is regarded as the father of contemporary evolution, he said that pre-biological evolution is a contradiction in terms. Because in the normal sense, any process of evolution which involves mutation and natural selection requires a mutating replicator in order to get going. So talking about molecular evolution can often give people the impression that you're assuming that there's some kind of mutating replicator in existence, when in fact what you're trying to do is to explain the existence of a mutating replicator.
And Larry, you said you're doing this to show that this whole documentary and this whole discussion does not just take place in the intelligent elite of this country. It also takes place right here on the Rick and Bubba Show.
Precisely.
Yeah. So we're the final part of this documentary.
That's right.
That alone is proof to me that there is a divine creator.
Right. If you don't believe there's a divine creator, this would not be happening right now. We'll be back.
Good stuff. Let's discuss Genesis. Almost every discussion on science and the Bible will eventually turn to the creation account that is recorded in the opening chapters of that particular book. Now, many have argued that since the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, that account has been vanquished as antiquated, as unsophisticated. What do you say about those opening chapters?
I think if we look at Genesis, we see very rapidly that it is at once, on the one side, a simple document, on the other side, a very profound document. And coming straight to the heart of the question, Larry, because this could be a very complex subject, the big issue, usually, with Genesis is the age of the earth and the universe, is it not? And so therefore it revolves around the question of the days. Now the first thing I would say is this, that Genesis has a lot more to say. Genesis 1 has a great deal more to say than the days. And the difficulty is that sometimes argument and discussion about the timing of events obscures the fact of the events. And the important assertions of Genesis, there is a God, God created, God upholds the universe. God didn't create the universe all at once. He did it in a sequence. However long or short you believe the days are, it's clearly a sequence. There were inputs when God spoke, and God said repeatedly. Now it seems to me those are the major things, because in the New Testament, which never mentions the days, in the New Testament the emphasis is, in the beginning was the Word, all things were made by Him. So that it's saying that information is prior to matter and energy. That seems to be a very profound insight. And it's missed if we trivialize the Bible. The Genesis account requires to be interpreted, because I understand it to be a very sophisticated account of creation. And its assertions are enormously powerful. When you read it, it just doesn't read like myth. In fact, many scholars argue that Genesis is a protest against the mythological interpretation of the ancient world. It's telling us, first of all, that there was a beginning. And even at that level, it's interesting, because people often say that belief in Scripture is useless because it has no predictive element, which we would expect in any true science. But, you know, for centuries, people believed that the universe was eternal. And if they'd listened to Scripture, they might have begun to look for evidence of a finite age to the universe long before they did. So, what do I say? I say that I believe what Scripture says with all my heart and my mind. But I would not be prepared to be dogmatic. And I'm very happy to look at the insights of science that they're given to me, because it seems to me that there is a strong measure of convergence. And to my mind, the fact of creation by far outweighs the timing of creation. And the arguments that I would wish to bring to bear, as I do in my book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? The arguments that I would wish to bring against not the kind of evolution that Darwin saw, the kind of microevolution that we see going on, I've no problem with that, but against macroevolution and some kind of evolutionary origin of life, the arguments that I will want to bring against that do not depend on the age of the universe, except that it's finite. If you add a few zeros, it doesn't harm any of those arguments whatsoever.
What kind of cultural power is given to them that tell the creation story?
I would say the cultural power is given to those who employ the biggest guns to support their creation story. And here we have a contemporary society where science has a very large voice, rightly so, because of the success and the technology it has spawned. We're all grateful to it. The clever thing that's going on is that the secularist agenda have harnessed, hijacked the cultural power of science to press their own agenda by arguing that their position is the nearest to the scientific one. I want to argue that that's false for all the reasons we've given, that in fact we need to redress the balance, because I think that Christian theism has much more right in that sense, both historically and in terms of the nature of the intellectual discourse, to say that it is the legitimate heir, so to speak, that should use the cultural power of science. But it's a very difficult one, because there's a deeper agenda. If we look at it from a biblical perspective, human beings are in rebellion against God. They don't want there to be a God. And it's quite interesting that some very prominent atheists are very open about this. I don't want there to be a God. Isaac Asimov said something like that. Paul Davis says things like that. Now, that's honest. I admire that honesty. But then we need to realize that their atheism is not a product of their science. That's the clever claim. Atheism is generated by science. No, they're bringing their atheism to it.
So not every statement made by a scientist is a scientific statement?
No, that's extremely important. And that's the trouble. You see, Carl Sagan, take the television series that made a great hit around the world. Cosmos, that's right. And he started it, the universe is all that there has been, ever has been, and ever will be. Well, that is not a statement of science. It is a statement by a scientist. Carl Sagan was a scientist. But it's not a statement of science. It's a statement of his belief. It's a statement, a confession to atheistic materialism. And, you know, one of the greatest geneticists over here, Richard Lewontin, made that very clear in a very famous essay in the New York Review of Books, where he was introducing Sagan's last book, The Demon-Haunted World. And he said, you know, the methods of science don't force us to materialism. It's not that. It's that we have a priori, from the very start, we are committed to a materialistic worldview. And so therefore that should condition the way we look at science. And he added, we must not let a divine foot through the door. I see a very fruitful area of dialogue between those of us who are Christian theists, basing our lives on the authority of Scripture, and the scientists. We want to be open to cross-fertilization, because the moment we start to give the impression that we are afraid of the truth, it's finished. All truth is God's truth. Why was there a sudden explosion in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe? In the words of C.S. Lewis, summing up Alfred North Whitehead's thesis, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, behind the explosion of modern science as we know it was belief in God, the lawgiver. Now, that is a staggeringly important fact. When I first told a Russian audience in the Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk that, they got angry, and I had to stop the lecture. And I said, why are you angry? I thought they were angry with me, but they weren't. They said, why did nobody ever tell us that before? They'd never heard that Newton believed in God, that Kepler believed in God, that Galileo believed in God, that the father of computing, Charles Babbage, believed in God. They'd never heard it. And so they'd never heard this notion that the driving power behind the rise of science was actually the worldview that created a framework to expect law and order.
At one time, a scientist might have as his motto, Deus scientiarum dominus. What has changed? When did the break occur between science and the Christian faith?
Well, there's no doubt that in the Middle Ages, this great theme of the Lord, the God of all knowledge, was very, very prevalent. Every aspect of human knowledge was seen as a reflection of divine wisdom. Many scholars would say that the bifurcation took place during the 18th century, with the growing emphasis that we sometimes refer to as the Enlightenment on the autonomy of human reason. We can sort these things out for ourselves. We can rely on human reason, we can rely on experiment, we sort things out, and we leave God to religious things. But in terms of the way the world works, that's secular knowledge. And so this bifurcation of the sacred and the secular, I think, became increasingly important in the 18th century and is still with us. In my view, it's a very unhelpful bifurcation. I think it's one that actually is intellectually discredited by recent work. But it's still there and it needs to be challenged.
When Newton discovered the inverse square law of gravitation, he didn't say, marvellous, I understand how it works, therefore I don't need God. In fact, what he did was to say, what a clever God who did it that way. In other words, he wasn't finding God in the bits of science he didn't understand. He was finding God in the bits he did understand. And that is a very profound difference. Sometimes you get the impression in the debates these days that people who believe in God are very much in the back foot, and they're trying desperately to find God in bits of the universe that science hasn't yet understood. Well, if that's the case, that is a very sad thing, isn't it? It seems to me that the main evidence is in the bits we do understand.
Well, I don't believe in a God of the gaps. I mean, it seems to me to be a very, very inadequate vision of reality. We can't explain this. Let's call it God. We can't explain that. Let's call it God. And then as scientific advance proceeds, these gaps get smaller. That's a very narrow vision of God. God is about the big picture. Why can we make sense of things at all? The Oxford philosopher of religion, Richard Swinburne, makes a very powerful point. Intelligibility requires explanation. It's not about gaps, it's about standing back and saying, let's look at the big picture and ask, what's the best explanation? And the best explanation, in my view, is that there is a God who has made this and us, and that enables us to correspond between the way things are and the way we think.
See, one of the criteria of truth, Larry, one of the important criteria of truth, there are lots of criteria for truth, but one of them is explanatory power. Why do we believe this theory is distinct from that theory? Now, at this point, to explain why science explains, a professor of philosophy at Oxford, Swinburne, very famous, he says, I do not deny that science explains, clearly explains. I postulate God to explain why science explains. And the very success of science in being able to explain is evidence for a much deeper and underlying rationality, that is, of God. Now that seems to me to be a very important and central argument. It's a sad thing, I think, when people restrict God to the gaps in scientific knowledge so that he in the end disappears like the grin on the proverbial Cheshire cat. Rather, one sees the evidence of God in the whole show, which is exactly what Scripture says. The heavens declare the glory of God and the earth shows his handiwork. It's not so much in what we don't understand that we see the genius of God. It's in what we do understand, so that we don't confine our thinking simply to those gaps in our knowledge. Now, of course, the gaps in our knowledge need a separate discussion, because there are things to be said about them. But that's not the place in the first instance where we should look for evidence of God in the universe.
Last month, I was in Oxford, your fair city, and I was at a dinner at one of the colleges there, and sitting next to me was a particle physicist, a man who, as far as I know, had no religious belief whatsoever. And we talked at some length. And at one point I asked him this question: what has your science, your study of science, what has it taught you? And he leaned in and he said, it has taught me that there are laws that are in motion that science is powerless to explain. I thought that was a very intriguing remark. And the very next day, I sat and listened to Richard Dawkins in a discussion on his book, The God Delusion, when the question was put to him, how do you explain origins? And he went on to offer some sort of modest response, and the interviewer interrupted and said, no. I mean, where did it all begin? How did it begin? And he said, well, the physicists are working on that. But once we have the laws of physics, science can explain everything else. And I thought back to my conversation just the night previously, where I sat with a physicist who said, in effect, we're not working on that. We can't work on that. We're powerless to explain it. Why is it that the physicists are much more open to theism, or to an intelligent cause than the biologists?
I find that a difficult question to answer, but I give you some reflections on it anyway. It seems to me that one of the issues in the debate is this. When physicists argue for evidence of an intelligent cause, they're basing their arguments on known physics, mainstream physics. What I mean by that is, in the last 50 or so years, we've assembled a lot of evidence of the fine-tuning of the universe. The fact that the fundamental constants of nature have to be within extremely fine limits in order for a universe to exist like ours in which life is possible. The physics of the quantum world is a very mysterious thing. And that has led, I think, to physicists being more cautious and perhaps more open. Now, often in biology, instead of people arguing for God on the basis of mainstream biology, they argue by contradicting mainstream biology. And of course, that's very controversial. And it helps me to get into this debate to understand that there are two kinds of arguments. There are the arguments like those of the physicists that flow out of mainstream science. But then in biology, and in particular in connection with the theory of evolution, there's a vocal group, particularly here in North America, who are arguing for God by apparently contradicting mainstream biology. And of course the biologists are very much inflamed by this. So there is an imbalance in the very nature of the way the arguments run. Now in biology, we're beginning to have a major revolution, the genetic revolution, which is now becoming an informational revolution. I mean, most biologists, I suspect, would disagree with me. And do remember, please, I'm not a biologist. But looking at it from the outside and beginning to see how the whole thing is moving towards my own subject and interest of mathematics and the nature of information as well, it seems to me that there's a possibility that, given time, there's going to be more evidence forthcoming from the biological side, but it's going to take some time coming. And sometimes I tell a story that goes like this. We go with a Chinese archaeologist into a cave and we follow her. I don't know much about archaeology. And there's scratches in the wall. And we pass two scratches that I ignore completely. And she stops and she says, human intelligence. And I say, don't be silly. It's just two scratches. And how can you postulate something as complex as the human brain to explain two scratches? But she says, look, these two scratches are the Chinese symbol Hun, which means a human being. And the only thing that can account for the two scratches is human intelligence. Oh, I say, that's interesting. And now by magic, she becomes an Oxford molecular biologist. And she takes me into a secret laboratory where there's a magic microscope that hasn't been invented yet. So I look down it, and in this microscope I see an unfolding double helix. And I see down the spines of the double helix little letters, C, G, A, A, T, C, G. And I say, what are those? She said, well, those are the letters of the genetic alphabet. You're looking at a human genome. And I say, well, they're letters. There are four of them. Yes, they code for the protein. You only need two binary to code for anything, so four is fine. So you can express anything. Oh, I say, so it's a language. It's semiotic. It carries meaning. That's right. It codes for the proteins. And I say, well, how many of those are there? 3.5 billion, roughly. Oh, I said, that's interesting. And they've got to be in the right order. Yes, like a computer program. One letter wrong and it may collapse. And I said, what's the origin of that ultimately? Chance and necessity, she says. What I say, chance? And the laws of nature, that's right. But I said, just a moment. 2 minutes ago we were in a cave in China and you saw two scratches. And you said, human intelligence. How is it that you now look at 3.5 billion letters in the right order and you say ultimately that's chance and necessity? I think something funny going on.
Christians today have largely accepted the notion that their faith has no intellectual teeth. Christ's dying words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" seem to express the feelings of many, complete abandonment. But Christianity is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. God is not dead. It seems we are witnessing a dramatic philosophical shift in the Western mind. As postmodernism or relativism reaches the end of itself, the pendulum is swinging back in the direction of belief in the absolute, and this affords Christians a renewed opportunity. But for that opportunity to yield results, we must re-engage and make public the faith that we have so readily privatized.
I've read that you started as an atheist, and you believed that empirical evidence, that this is where it would lead you. What changed?
Well, I think when I was a younger man, it was very, very clear to me that science disproved belief in God. I mean, belief in God was for sad, mad, or bad people. There was no evidence for it whatsoever. And also, of course, because I was growing up in Northern Ireland, there seemed to be a link between religion and violence. And in my very simplistic way of thinking, I thought, get rid of religion, you get rid of violence. So it's just obvious to me. The problem is that many things seem obvious until you really start to think about them. And when I came to Oxford to read chemistry as an undergraduate, I began to realize, I think, that the evidential basis for atheism wasn't actually as strong as I had thought. And above all, by studying the philosophy of science, I began to realize that we are forced to believe scientific theories, often not because the evidence forces us to that position, but because there seems no better explanation. In other words, we are not proving, we're simply saying this seems to be the best way of making sense of this. Now, I began to realize that didn't just apply to science, it applied to a lot of other things as well. And that was, if you like, the doorway which forced me to rethink so many things. So for me, the relationship of science and faith has always been enormously important, because in one sense, I swapped my atheist faith for a Christian faith and sought to relate that to science instead. It seems to me science poses some challenges to faith. Now, some of these are simply unrealistic challenges. Prove it! Well, if we said that, I'm afraid an awful lot of science will go out the window as well. It's about show us that there are good reasons for this belief. Now, that is common to science and faith. I think really the big challenge that science poses to faith, actually, is one that Christians need to take very, very seriously, and it's this. Most Christians are very, very good at telling us what they believe, but not why they believe it. They don't show us their intellectual working. They don't actually know very often why they believe, for example, in the Trinity or divinity of Christ. My plea would be that we have churches and Christian colleges that would really equip Christians to answer these questions, to know their faith well, to be able to defend it robustly. I believe that would be good for them, because it will remind them that their faith is not irrational or arbitrary, but is rooted in the deepest structures of reality, reassuring them, but also enabling them to engage in public debate, which is what we need at this moment.
In the course of our discussions, we've talked on many occasions about the importance of one's faith, that if it is an authentic faith, that it's to be out in the public.
Yes, it covers the whole of life. It's absurd to say leave it at the door. It means it's unimportant. Jesus said, you shall know the truth will set you free. I mean, looking at it from my perspective, it's so logical. If there is a God who created the universe, and if Jesus is the Son of God, God incarnate, and we can contact God and have a relationship with God through him, that is, by definition, the biggest, the most fascinating thing that any human being could be involved in. And I mean, far from, how could that possibly be a burden? It seems to me that the atheistic worldview gives us a tiny universe, very tiny. And it ends with death, and there's nothing. There's no ultimate significance of life. It's very hard to read meaning back into it, morality back into it, and all the rest of this. And even science to legitimize. Whereas, if there is a God who made the colours, he put the colours into the universe. He didn't take them out of it. He put the music into the universe. He didn't take it out of it. It's we human beings that have spoiled it by rejecting him. So that by coming back to God through Christ, it gives me an enormous sense of fulfillment. And it vibrates with life. It's the exact opposite of death. Whereas the atheistic worldview shuts one up in a tomb, an eternal tomb. Literally so, because if there is no God, then the real power brokers are the fundamental forces of nature. It seems to me that atheism is a hopeless philosophy, whereas Christianity opens up all the possibilities. The crucial question for me is it true or not? And I believe it is true, because there is evidence both from nature and through the Bible, and in particular through the life and work of Jesus Christ. And the evidence is there. So why should why should one be ashamed of it? One should be absolutely thrilled with it. And therefore, we should be out there in the marketplace.
Well, I've always taken something that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount with great seriousness, being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And one of those is an image of presence. Salt gets into things, and when it's there, it gets noticed. And for me, that's an extremely important image for Christians. You are called to be a Christian, but also to be present in the world, get noticed, and be able to bring your ideas to the attention of the world. The light of the world is an image not of presence, but of projection. And again, it's about being noticed, but this time in a different sense. One of the reasons I write books is to get ideas into circulation. What we need are Christians in the media who will be able to write those books, make those programs that enable us to get these ideas out of the churches into the world at large.
So you would encourage Christians not to simply stay in their own Christian communities and enclaves, but to get out into the secular world and to pursue whatever gifts and abilities they might have, not necessarily in a quote-unquote ministerial endeavor.
I think many Christians, when they feel under threat, circle the wagons. They retreat from the world. What we need is Christians who have the confidence to go into the world. They'll need to come back out of it for refreshment from time to time. That's what churches are for, to recharge their batteries, to renew that vision, to be an oasis in the midst of a desert. But there is no point in them staying inside their corrals where we need them outside, being a witness and a presence in the world.
How have you been able to do this and avoid, the ivory tower existence as just an academic? How have you managed to keep your Christian life fresh and relevant?
Well, I believe very strongly that faith is at its best when it's in action, when it has to defend itself. And therefore, one of the things I love doing is get involved in debates, because you are forced to answer real questions, urgent questions that the world is asking, and you are being judged as you answer them. And that means I have to know I can give answers, but even before that, I have to know that there are answers that may be given. And it seems to me that forces me to make sure I can answer those questions for myself, and if the answers are good, I want to make sure others know them as well.
So your theology is, as it were, hammered out on the anvil of controversy?
I believe in public engagement, and I believe that public engagement is the anvil on which the sword of truth is sharpened.
My time is up. I simply want to say two things briefly, and they are these. I was once a visiting professor in Israel, and I was presented with a memento of my visit. It was a symbol of the University of Bar Ilan. And it was the letters in Hebrew with a stereoscopic microscope, but the barrels of the microscope were formed out of the two scrolls of the Torah, or the law. And I thought, what a brilliant picture of what this whole debate is about. Perhaps I think I would agree with another Nobel Prize winner in physics, Sir Lawrence Bragg, who said, science and religion are opposed, just like the fingers and thumb of my hand are opposed, that between them we can grasp everything. And ladies and gentlemen, I seem to think that another voice said long ago that if we search for the truth, It can do nothing less than set us free. Thank you very much.